What's up, YouTube? I'm an unuseful idiot, and today I'm going to ramble a bit about Jordan Peterson, the political compass, and the Big Five personality index. Let's get to it.
I want to go talk to Peterson. Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Then why are you...
Why were they here?
Well, how can I answer
Are there views in alignment with yours?
At some point you
I
have to
think that's
realize...
a foolish question. So look, I will answer your question, okay? I've studied Nazism for a very long time. It's been 4 decades, and I understand it very well. And I can tell you that there's some awful people lurking in the corners, and they're ready to come out. And if the radical left keeps pushing the way
That sounds very much like a
they're
threat.
going to come.
That sounds very much
That's
like a
not
threat.
a threat.
That sounds very much like a threat. We're saying if it wasn't legislation.
I've got to stop, guys. There's too many of you.
Okay, one simple
I've had
question.
enough. Sorry, I
Dr.
can't do
Peterson,
this.
one simple question.
No, I'm done.
I thought we were statistically irrelevant.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I don't exist.
And a trans person asked
I do have
literally
the authority to determine
please
whether or
refer
not
to me.
there
Why
was
do
a-
I have the
Why
authority
do
to
you have the
determine what I say?
Why do you
What
have-
kind of question
Why do you
is
have
that?
the authority? Let me finish. Why do you have the authority to determine whether or not an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns? Like, if I asked you, would you please use they them pronouns for me? What?
It would depend on what I thought of your motivation.
Those are my pronouns. Those are my
There's no
pronouns.
motivation.
No, I know. No one ever has any motivation.
So if you spend any time following YouTube skeptics and watching social and political commentary on YouTube or other cancerous content of that nature, you've probably heard of Dr. Jordan Peterson by now. So to those that are woke as fuck, the man needs no introduction. But for the sake of all the normies that may be watching, Dr. Peterson is a Canadian professor of clinical psychology who rose to internet fame almost overnight after speaking out against the ill-conceived Canadian human rights legislation, Bill C-16, in September of last year. A bill that sought to establish rights protections based on the concept of gender identity, so that transgender people and other gender non-conforming individuals on the LGBTQIAA+ clusterfuck fringe be granted the ability to file suit against others for human rights abuses on the basis of discrimination for issues as minuscule as not respecting their claimed quote-unquote gender identity, should someone fail to refer to them in public using the proper pronouns of the non-binary snowflake's choosing. In a series of videos entitled Professor Against Political Correctness, Dr. Peterson thoroughly examined the language of the proposed bill and went on to make a compelling case articulating the bill's inherent incoherency, arguing that the implementation of such legislation would ultimately stand as an unprecedented restriction upon free speech due to the coercive nature in which it forces people to use certain words and language when speaking, consequentially categorizing spoken protest to doing so as hate speech. But as captivating as the cringe generated by that draconian shit show of SJW lunacy that has resulted as fallout from Dr. Peterson's videos is, Dr. Peterson himself remains the central character of most importance to this story, the Jungian archetypal prophet, roughly speaking. It is difficult to imagine that there could be a more fitting person than Dr. Peterson to come forward and take a principled stance against the increasingly prevalent adherence to political correctness thought policing and identity politics that has effectively become the mainstream dogma of liberal thought. Likewise, it is difficult to imagine a better time for an outspoken martyr to come forth than during a period where the political and cultural divide between liberals and conservatives is perhaps the greatest it has ever been within the past century. And it is of no small feat that Dr. Peterson has managed to maintain a calm and collected composure in the face of repeated protest, harassment, and slander by radical left-wing extremists opposed to his views on free speech, as well as in the face of excessive scrutiny at the hands of critics looking to push an ideological agenda. The man stands firm in his conviction, speaking transcendent truth to crowds in an intimately forthright and humble fashion, summoning a sort of mystical aura that coaxes the audience into the willful surrender of their undivided attention. To borrow one of Peterson's own catchphrases, it's a mere statement of fact to say that the man is sorted the fuck out. A true master and genius of his field, Dr. Peterson has been able to cultivate an exceptionally sophisticated synthesis of the relationship between the nature of human personality and the inclination towards adopting certain political beliefs, making it a large part of his life's work to map and research how temperament influences ideology. But despite Dr. Peterson's profoundly deep understanding of totalitarian political philosophies and their underlying roots in the nihilistic and postmodern rejections of human worth, dignity, and value, I'd like to live up to my username by venturing out on a limb and attempt to defend a rather bold claim, which brings us to the second part of this video. Jordan Peterson is doing it wrong, but to be a little more precise and a little less hyperbolic, I'd like to suggest instead that Dr. Peterson may be doing it backwards, and there may be a superior way to go about excavating, so to speak, the relationship between personality traits and political identity. In much the same fashion as his contemporary, the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, Dr. Peterson seems to be more apt to approach his research from the perspective of a psychologist, and in doing so, he is perhaps more adept at mapping the personality index of an individual than at constructing a consistent and definitive method through which he may differentiate between political ideologies. He seems to lack a way in which to segregate beliefs into categories on the basis of some objective metric. While, admittedly, I know very little about the nature of Dr. Peterson's work in this regard outside of the bits and pieces he has discussed in some of his interviews, it is my contention that Dr. Peterson would be able to uncover more useful information about the nature of the relationship between personality and politics in such a way so that he could draw connections between the two with greater consistency and accuracy were he to concretely conceptualize the political spectrum by constructing a sort of personality profile of differentiating ideological schools of political thought. By defining the underlying values inherent to the foundations of any given political worldview, subjects of study could explicitly be classified as belonging to a specific political group based on the values reflected by the policies they profess to support, rather than based on a much looser metric, such as self-reporting on whether they identify as a liberal or a conservative, right-wing or left-wing, or even any other simpler survey which places people into very broad, sometimes undefined categories where they may lean in one direction or another despite consistently voting against partisan lines for some other unknown ideological reason. The political landscape is far more nuanced than the binary nature of our language would have us believe, and over the course of the last election cycle, it has come to my attention not only that there are more similarities than differences between political worldviews, but that many people fundamentally don't understand the values and principles inherent to the formulation of their political identity. Consequentially, this results in people being motivated to adopt an ideological political identity on the basis of their feeling rather than on the basis of principled reason. Peterson himself regularly speaks at length about the importance of establishing a hierarchical system of values as a tool essential to guiding the individual towards achieving both long and short-term goals. And so, to this end, I propose the following political compass as a means by which to consistently classify individuals by their political beliefs. It is a political compass that defines and categorizes political ideologies by their foundational principles, as well as the values inherent within. The viewer should note that for purposes of consistency, this compass is framed around the guiding principles of libertarian philosophy, and so should be wary of bias in that capacity. As you can see, the compass contains 4 major axes, each separating a pair of dialectical principles. Political ideologies are characterized by procedurally defining them according to their generally preferred principle, axis by axis. Classical liberalism, where I tend to fall, for example, can be described as right-wing, individualist, libertarian liberalism. But all of this begs the question, exactly what is the difference between the principles each axis describes, and how are these principles defined? Axis 1 describes ideological views towards the government's role in regulating economic activity. Issues such as minimum wage, as well as state-mandated licensing requirements, can be used to frame different economic worldviews into a binary. People who are left-wing typically believe that the government is justified in establishing economic regulations in order to promote general welfare in the interest of protecting the public good. People who are right-wing align themselves more with the principle of voluntary exchange. That is to say that as long as an economic trade between individuals occurs voluntarily and in full honesty, government oversight is not necessary. Thus, a person may be free to agree to work for an employer at a wage below the minimum, as well as free to hire an unlicensed physician to oversee their healthcare needs, as risky as that may seem. Axis 2 describes personal views towards uniformity or homogeneity and diversity or heterogeneity as desirable societal values. Categorically, this difference between the two can be thought of as the dichotomy between collectivism and individualism. Issues which can be used to frame these divergent values fundamentally include anything related to the legal usage and definition of words. Thus, the difference between collectivists and individualists is extremely relevant to Jordan Peterson's defense of free speech and can be further illustrated by political views related to marriage equality as well as access to segregated public accommodation. While there is a profound difference of expression between conservatives and liberals regarding the collectivist-individualist dichotomy, it can be argued that a consistent individualist will embrace marriage equality while rejecting most progressive positions on public accommodations, on the grounds that the government may not justly define specific legal terms in a way that compromises or jeopardizes the individual rights of its citizens. A collectivist, on the other hand, will tend to support policies which will uphold their personal conceptualization of a thing in abstract as being objective, universal, and absolute, such that their perception of reality is codified into law. Collectivists will therefore either assert that marriage should be viewed as a contract which exclusively describes a relationship between a man and a woman, or that the segregation of public accommodations should reflect whether or not an individual perceives themselves to fit within the group the space is meant to accommodate. If viewed within the framework of libertarian principles, it can be said that while allowing people to marry whomever they wish is consistent with free association, forcing people to share a locker room or lavatory with people who may be different from them in a way that is unexpected and ultimately either causes reasonable discomfort or stands to jeopardize personal safety is not. Axis 3 separates views related to social standards regarding the division between freedom and liberty, and to some degree reflects the scope of an individual's moral compass. This axis serves as the dividing line between libertarians and authoritarians in relation to the degree to which a person accepts the principle of self-ownership, or the idea that a person may do whatever they wish to their body, regardless of the consequences or the moral value of their choices. The ideological difference between libertarians and authoritarians is reflected in issues such as the regulation of drugs, alcohol, and access to reproductive rights services. While libertarianism, taken to its extreme, will argue for the legalization of drugs, the abolition of a state-established drinking age, as well as the lifting of restrictions and regulations related to reproductive rights, authoritarianism, taken to its extreme, will argue for the criminalization and outright prohibition of goods, services, and behavioral practices deemed to either be unethical or corrosive to society. Axis 4 fundamentally marks the division between liberalism and conservatism as differing political ideologies. While liberalism can be defined broadly by the acceptance of obligatory social responsibility, and more specifically as the acceptance of social contract theory as an inherently valid concept, conservatism can be defined broadly by the acceptance of individual responsibility, and more specifically, the acceptance of the non-aggression principle as an axiomatic truth. Differences between these two diametrically opposed ideologies are often exemplified by issues related to taxation, welfare, and social safety nets. Liberals typically defend mandated participation within these government-run programs as a civic duty inherent to the social contract. Conservatives typically argue that the participation in government-run social security programs should be voluntary, and that it is the responsibility of the individuals to secure their own welfare and protect their own well-being. Upon completing this compass some time ago, I realized that while these 4 metrics successfully establish an objective framework through which political ideologies can more accurately be categorized, it fails to completely account for the entirety of the political spectrum. As a 2-dimensional chart, close examination of the compass gives rise to a number of questions. Where would one place the alt-right? What about civic nationalists or Donald Trump himself? And finally, how can this compass be used to draw any sort of relationship between a person's political ideology and their personality? Although I had originally planned to address these questions in this part, I had also planned on making this video around 15 minutes long. This being the case, I will spare the additional deliberation for a follow-up video and share instead some concluding thoughts. Any person who is politically well-informed will probably tell you that neither Donald Trump nor the alt-right really can be framed within the liberal-conservative binary. And as far as the compass relates to the Big Five, the autist in me can't help but to think that another categorical metric could conveniently establish a one-to-one correlation between political beliefs and temperamental properties. After considering these issues for some time, I finally constructed a solution, producing the following revelation. The alt-right exists in a 3rd political dimension not shown on this chart and is defined by a 5th ideological axis. The 5th ideological axis is a z-axis, resulting in the political spectrum taking the shape of an Egyptian pyramid. This z-axis represents the scope of ideological views related to nationalism and cultural preservation, and I refer to this 3rd political dimension manifested by this z-axis as the nativist nationalist dimension. Thus, it is the nature of this political dimension, as well as the relationship between the political compass and the Big Five personality index that I will deliberate on in part 2 of this video series. That about wraps it up for this video. Don't forget to smash that motherfucking like button and leave your hate speech in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.